Welcome everyone. What a great pleasure to be with you again in this, I think it's, well, whatever week it is. I just look forward to this time together. Doing this video, Bouyer chapter 5, really one of my favorite chapters of the book on the principles of the ascetic life. So several beautiful points here, and I want to try to speed through them, though that is not the nature of asceticism, to speed through something, but instead is to really take your time. Thinking of the Spanish word despacito, slowly. There is a little inside joke there for those of you who know the Justin Bieber song, but anyways, slowly, despacito, but in a spiritual sense and a holy sense. So, page 163, Bouyer talks about Christian asceticism is the systematic adaptation of our whole life to the mystery of the cross of Christ. I think it's a beautiful definition, very precise. What is asceticism? From the Greek word ascesis, that means from the Greek verb askein, that means to work or to exercise. So ascesis is spiritual exercise, is the literal meaning of the word. There's a similar root, another Greek root where we get the word in English, athlete. So Christian asceticism is like spiritual athleticism, really. And no matter what our body type is, what's going on with our bodies, our souls can be very agile, athletic, and it's really encouraging, especially as we get older or experience disability or whatever it might be, or illness, that our soul can be on fire with the love of God and be very spiritually fit and athletic. And St. Paul talks about this in his letters, that physical exercise and fitness is of value, but spiritual exercise and fitness is of highest value. That's what we're after here in Christian asceticism. And on page 164, Bouyer says, what it is not, Christian asceticism is not these Buddhist notions for all the merits in you could say Buddhist monasticism, but Christian asceticism is not abstention as an end in itself, abstaining from things as if that's kind of the point, or an annihilation of the self. It's not a movement of a total self-annihilation in the sense that the self is destroyed. That's not Catholic doctrine at all. But we are meant to be redeemed in the integrity of our being, body and soul, and the uniqueness of our personhood. Christian asceticism is not Manichaeist disincarnate pessimism. It's not Neoplatonic pure disengagement from the material. But it begins, Christian asceticism begins, he says on page 166, with an affirmation of the goodness of God's creation. So it's a kind of paradox, because asceticism does involve the highest degrees of detachment from the goods of creation, of the earth, and even spiritual goods. But it's not because the goods are bad. It's because God is goodness itself. And in order for us to fail in a good way, to make goods into idols, we have to detach ourselves from all these goods in order to be bound, most of all bonded to God, who is goodness itself. Page 167 in Bouyer, a very nice quote toward the middle of the page, where he goes through the Old Testament notions of asceticism, that begins with the affirmation of the goodness of creation, going back to the Genesis narratives of creation, God finding everything that God made as good, and especially the human beings as the crowning of all creation as very good. But this quote on 167, for Israel, the people of Israel, idolatry was one with an exploitation of the riches of the world by self-centered humanity, seeking above all to satisfy themselves to assure their own tangible satisfactions. To the extent to which they do this, people forget God. So it's very interesting. When we exploit the riches of the world and become very self-centered, we can then forget God. Often it's when we're struggling financially or suffering through different things that we draw closer to God. So in any case, I think that's a helpful quote there, page 167. And then on 168, Bouyer goes on to talk about the cure for idolatry is to deprive ourselves of these various goods, these good things. In a way, people will come to recognize once more that God is the sole source whence these things came to them. Hence the conclusion of the prophet Hosea, "This is why I allure her, says God. I will lead her into the desert and there speak to her heart." Spiritual asceticism has its geographical basis in the desert. And wherever there's a desert, this is where the soul encounters God in great intimacy. Page 171, trying to move along, keep this under 15 minutes is my goal. Page 171, there's an attraction of the desert for the monastic life, beginning with the desert hermits. It's also called the eremitic way of life from the Greek word for desert. There's an attraction to the soul on fire with the love of God to the desert, not just because it's quiet or it lacks a kind of urban scene, but because the climate and the landscape of the desert itself is very plain, simple, and it's a great venue in which to encounter the living God and to undergo this radical metanoia of the heart, this Greek word, metanoia, change of heart, change of mind, conversion. The whole point of asceticism on 173, Bouyer says, is to follow Christ, and it involves an eros crucified. We have to be careful with this notion of this Greek, one of the Greek notions of love, eros, in relation to another one, agape. I think the best treatment of these is in a very brief way is Pope Benedict's 2005 encyclical Deus Caritas Est, where he affirms both eros and agape. But agape, this self-donating kind of love, often has to purify eros, which itself is that magnetic attraction to the good, the true, the beautiful, but can often become lustful or concupiscent without being bound to agape love, that sacrificial love, that self-donating love, that altruistic love, that self-forgetful love. So eros and agape must be unified together. Eros itself in the tradition is not demonized. If we look at the 6th century mystical theologian Dionysius the Areopagite, he calls God both eros and agape in the Greek. Look at Pope Benedict's treatment of eros in Deus Caritas Est again. But it is true that in the New Testament, the premier word for love is agape. Eros doesn't even appear in the Greek New Testament, but nevertheless in the tradition of the church, it's there, and not always under the shadow of suspicion. But we do know eros is very powerful and does need to be purified, or in a sense crucified, vis-a-vis agape love. Page 174 then, Bouyer talks about St. Ignatius of Antioch and the ascetic vision of martyrdom. Has some great quotes here. Page 174, Ignatius believes that in his own death, Christ will slay death and sin to communicate to him in perfect identification with Christ fullness of life. This is the goal of asceticism. It's not deprivation and only deprivation, but there is a necessary deprivation that has to take place in order for us to receive, live into this fullness of life that God created us for. This is the meaning of the Eucharist as well. It's not a gift of death. It's not a phenomenon of subtraction or reduction. This is a gift of life, of addition, of plenty, of fullness. So further on 174, so later on, when persecution had ceased to rage, even though new outbreaks were to be feared at any moment within Christianity, especially after the Edict of Milan of the Roman Emperor Constantine in 313, the systematic practice of asceticism came into existence as preparation for the martyrdom that always was possible. Christians were not meant to simply settle down in the world as if it was their permanent dwelling place, because that's not true. This is not our permanent dwelling place. We know that very well, even though we pretend like it is so much. So it's a temptation for us to think that this world is our permanent dwelling place, to relax in relation to the spiritual battle we're called into every day. But to fight against it, these early Christians exercised themselves in doing without what they might be called at any moment to leave for Christ. Beautifully put by Bouyer. And then he talks on page 175 about Origen of Alexandria and other patristic writers reasoned that if martyrdom is not to be the crown of asceticism, asceticism of itself by itself can constitute, as it were, an unbloody martyrdom. Is its purpose not to free us to belong wholly to Christ, to the divine will, whatever it may be? Beautifully put by this idea of an unbloody martyrdom. The patristic writers are saying we're all called to this as followers of Christ. This is the life of Christ. It goes to the cross. Again, that was the opening line, that asceticism is this systematic adaptation to the whole of our life, to the mystery of the cross of Christ. We're all called to be martyrs, period, as followers of Christ, not only in the sense of being his witnesses, but in the sense of this radical, self-donating, sacrificial existence, way of being in the world. And we can choose this for ourselves. We can lean into it on a daily basis through rigorous spiritual exercise. It's not pleasant. It's not easy. It's not instant gratification. It seems to subtract from all these good things in life. But when we enter into this way of asceticism, we find that something floods in to our being that isn't there when we go about life just satisfying craving after craving, chasing pleasure after pleasure, especially concerning the flesh, material goods, and so on. Okay, I was trying to keep this under 15 minutes. Maybe we'll go over just a little bit. But, I'm sorry. But in any case, the origin of monasticism was the substitute for martyrdom, as I just mentioned. And as soon as the church ceased to be forced by the world to live in the world without being of the world, she felt herself obliged to live in this way by her own choice. Now that the world was offering her its friendship, she seemed to fear being engulfed in it, hence monasticism. And we think of the evangelical counsels here as well, of poverty, chastity, and obedience, that are chosen voluntarily to live this life of martyrdom, even in the sense of unbloody martyrdom. And it's very interesting, on the top of page 176, Bouyer says that marriage diminishes our freedom to follow Christ because it involves new bonds with the world are being established in it to a certain degree. And so to this extent, marriage diminishes our freedom to follow Christ in a certain sense. St. Paul says as much in 1 Corinthians, his advice to virgins to remain as such. As a married man, I know what he's getting at here. It's very real. This morning I was looking at our bank account with my wife and, wishing we had some more funds in there, thinking about all the different repairs in the house and thinking about all the things going on with my kids. It's blessed. Hashtag blessed. Yes, marriage. But at the same time, it's not the eschatological state of human being, meaning in heaven, and Jesus says to the Sadducees, there is no marriage. People are not given in marriage. All are like the angels of his heavenly Father. So marriage is a temporary sacramental sign to the eternal marriage of the wedding feast of the Lamb. But yeah, Jesus calls people who can forfeit the good of marriage for the kingdom of God to do so if they're able. He says this in the gospel. So it's there. Marriage is still a real vocation, but it's very challenging because, as Bouyer says, there's so many ties to the world, in the world, as if your home, your family life was forever. Because you want to create stability for your family. You want to make sure all your kids have, all the various basic necessities of life and are getting to live according to their activities they're interested in and so on. But anyways, there's a lot of administration in the domestic church. Okay, so page 177. The thing about Christian asceticism, it may seem like it's a lot of gloominess or something, but Bouyer says fundamentally it's a fundamental optimism, even though it involves a kind of conditional pessimism. It's fundamentally optimistic about that fullness of life, the abundance of life Jesus came to give us. He mentions in passing the stylites, who were some radical desert hermits, especially, who condemn themselves to immobility on an isolated rock or pillar. So another very radical demonstration of Christian discipleship, even to forfeit one's ability to move about in space. What can we say? That's very radical. For the sake of time, I'll just keep going to mention Celtic monasticism, these various types of monasticism that flourish around the Mediterranean, European, African, and beyond world as Christianity continues to spread throughout the world. Page 178, we read in passing about voluntary scourging, also called self-flagellation, where someone would whip themselves with cords. Not overdone, but just to keep their flesh in check in a way. People would wear hair shirts, make themselves uncomfortable. This is all part of asceticism, but done within temperance, moderation, and in no way is it akin to self-injury, a kind of psychological disorder that can happen. Two last points. Page 179. Bouyer mentioned St. Margaret Mary Alacoque and the development of the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And he mentioned some different kinds of asceticism of compassion with St. Francis of Assisi, Henry Suso. But then Margaret Mary Alacoque, this asceticism of reparation and substitution. This is a very powerful form of asceticism to this day. For the Carmelites, it's central that we go to prayer on behalf of sinners, on behalf of other people, on behalf of other people who are suffering with different things, that I can go to prayer in solidarity with them, even substituting myself for them, like Jesus substituted himself for us. This is something St. Paul talks about. I make up in my body what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. And then we have, finally, page 182, Christian asceticism is not dolorism. It's not just sadness and suffering, a kind of sadomasochism type of thing. No, it's not this. But instead, it's an effort toward liberation. Christian asceticism can remain healthy only by remaining authentic. And it cannot remain authentic in any other way than by a continual reference, as explicit as possible, to the fundamental truth of faith, the revelation of the love of God in its most transcendent, most supernatural aspect through the mystery of the cross. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining me on this video segment, Chapter 5, Bouyer.